right. So, welcome everyone who has joined us here on Zoom and are watching this live streamed on different platforms. I am Amit Khurana from the Center for Science and Environment. CSC is a New Delhi-based non-profit policy research and advocacy organization working towards sustainable and equitable development and equitable solutions for the global South. Also a very warm welcome to our expert panelists from different organizations and countries. We really appreciate your presence, as some of you have joined us from their mornings in the US. So today's discussion is about a specific aspect on antimicrobial resistance. Antimicrobial resistance, as you all know, is a silent pandemic which is known to have severe impact on health, livelihood, and economies. Now, specifically, this is to discuss and understand if antibiotics or any other aspect of it or of AMR response can be considered a global public good. And if yes, then what would it mean? What could be the implications, such as with respect to funding, international cooperation required for the AMR response? And then, of course, we also want to know what specifically can be considered a global public good. Is it the antibiotic effectiveness, antibiotic innovation, antibiotic access, or the entire AMR response to the AMR crisis? So now, the background to this discussion is the assessment that we published in July this year, which not only highlighted that the global antibiotic pipeline is weak, fragile, stagnant, but it also highlighted that most of the big companies who are developing antibiotics have actually left the space. And this is not just about the failure of the markets, but very much about the huge profits in other profitable areas like cancer, autoimmune disorders, and metabolic disorders. Now, we also pointed out that small and medium-scale companies have taken up the responsibility, but they are struggling. There are clearly challenges, big challenges for them to overcome. There clearly are quite a few financing initiatives to support the antibiotic innovation ecosystem, but a lot still needs to be done to support this antibiotic innovation. Now, these were the broad findings, and my colleague Gauri would give a very small presentation to give you details. But just to also let you know that in addition to the broad set of suggestions that we outlined in our assessment, we also talked about the need to discuss and assess if antibiotics or, let's say, AMR response can be considered a global public good. And clearly recognizing that, yes, there are some discussions, deliberations happening at the global level. And we are hoping that today's discussion actually informs those discussions, those deliberations in a much better way. Now, following our assessment, we actually discussed this issue with global experts as well as national experts in India over 2 webinars. We conducted the first webinar with global experts, and it was clear that the focus was to understand the scale and the extent of the antibiotic pipeline crisis. But it came out that it's the coordination and prioritization which is also equally important to address. It also came out that the access has to be very strongly tied up to the pipeline crisis. Now, that was our first set of discussions with first set of experts globally from global stakeholders. Then we moved on to trying and understanding the problems and the challenges of small and medium scale antibiotic developers from India. And here too, we realized that yes, in addition to the financing measures, more funding, yes, but there clearly are some barriers which need non-financing measures, I mean, such as regulatory harmonization, which will not only impact the innovation, spur the innovation, but also help the access. Now, with these 2 set of background discussions in mind, we move on to this third webinar, which is third in the series of 4 webinars, the fourth which is planned for Antibiotic Awareness Week on November 21. Now, this third webinar is essentially, as I said, is focused on goods, and I'm really pleased, very much pleased and thankful and grateful to the right sort of experts that we have today to discuss this issue, understand it from the experts. and see how it can help the global AMR response. We have with us Gavin Yemi, who is the Director, Center for Policy Impact in Global Health, Duke Global Health Institute, USA. And Gavin has agreed to stay with us for the 90 minutes, despite the hectic schedule that he has in the morning in the US. So thank you, Gavin, for that. I also have Kerry Elgar, who is the Senior Policy Analyst, Development Cooperation Directorate, OECD, and she is joining us from France. So thank you, Kerry. I have Anna Hoblom, Director, React Europe, Sweden. And I just took help from Anna to understand how I can pronounce her second name. So thank you, Anna. Then I have Frank Birth. Thank you, Frank, very much again, joining us from your early morning in the US. We are grateful. For everyone, Frank is from the Pandemic Fund Secretariat, Washington, DC. And Frank is also an expert in livestock. So we are happy to have Frank with us. And then we have Rohit Malpani. Rohit is an independent consultant, also a senior advisor for GARDP. So really, really excited to actually take this discussion forward with all the great experts that we have. The way we have structured this is we first hear from my colleague Gauri, who will quickly talk about our assessment and give us key takeaways from the set of discussions that we had, and touch upon very briefly touch upon the basic concepts of GPGs so that all of us are on the same page. And then I will of course request each of these panelists to actually share their opening remarks on a particular aspect of this discussion. And then lastly, we will have some questions for panelists, and I will try to also pick up some relevant ones picked up from the Q&A box from the participants. So with that, I would request Gauri, my colleague, and Gauri, you have about 10 to 12 minutes.
Sure. Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Yeah.
Just keep it full screen, Gauri.
Yeah. So I'll just discuss some of the points that were earlier discussed in the introduction. My name is Gauri Arora. I work with the Sustainable Food Systems team at CSE, and I'll be giving this presentation on behalf of the entire AMR team here. So I'll start this presentation with the key findings and observations from our story that we did for Down to Earth, which is our fortnightly magazine. So I'll start with the key three crises that we're facing in AMR currently right now, which is the fact that antibiotics are becoming ineffective. There's the issue of the antibiotic development pipeline. And there's the third issue, which is the issue of access. So for our story that we did for Down to Earth, we focused on the antibiotic development pipeline, which I'll go into more details now. So the pipeline for priority pathogens has been stagnant for the past many years, as we can see from the diagram, which is for 5 years at least. What are priority pathogens? They are 12 pathogens, which is characterized into high critical medium by the WHO, which is to guide the global antibiotic research. So this slide basically gives a holistic view of the antibiotic development pipeline, which is currently there as per the WHO database, updated late till 2021, which focuses on priority pathogens, M. tuberculosis, and C. difficile. So as we can see, there are currently 297 candidates, antibacterial candidates, out of which 77 are in clinical development and 217 are in preclinical development, and only 3 are in pre-registration. So if we look at the clinical pipeline, there are only 45 traditional candidates, which are the agents that act by directly targeting the components which are necessary for bacterial growth or to kill the pathogen. And there are only 32 non-traditional candidates, which are the agents that lack the intrinsic antibacterial activity, and they work through other means. Moving again to the traditional candidates, out of those 45, there's only 28 candidates which are targeting WHO priority pathogens. So one might think that this 297 antibacterial candidate number is not that less, but it is in comparison to the number of candidates that are there for other disease areas. For example, there are more than 10,000 medicines which are under clinical development for cancer. There are about 1,800 for neuropsychiatric conditions, and there are about 1,500 for endocrine and blood and immune disorders. So I'll just give a brief overview of the clinical development pipeline. As we can see, there are only 9 in phase 3. There is none in M. tuberculosis. There's only 2 for critical priority pathogens. And holistically, as we can see, this is being done by small and medium scale developers. The situation is somewhat same in the non-traditional antibiotic candidates. There are only 5 in phase 3. There are only 2 in pre-registration stage, and there's none for M. tuberculosis, only 1 in phase 3. And so something that we've observed once again is that this is still being done by small and medium scale developers. If I now move to the preclinical pipeline, which is the long-term scenario, which we've seen earlier, there were about 217 candidates. But if we looked at in the detail, there are only 3 out of these 217 candidates, which are in the final stages, which is the investigative new drug development. This is too less a pool, considering the high risk failure at this stage. And so something that finally we look at once again is that 85% of preclinical candidates are also being developed by micro, small, and medium developers. So what is the reason behind that? So in our story, we did an analysis of the clinical pipeline for very big 15 pharmaceutical companies. And what we saw out of that assessment is that if we accumulatively see the molecules for those 15 companies, we saw that out of 1,007 molecules, only 13 are antibacterial candidates, which are being developed by 4 companies, and 8 of which is just being developed by 1 company, which is GSK. In comparison, there are 411 candidates for cancer. There is 150 for immunology and 84 for cardiology, metabolism, or renal diseases. There were companies which were earlier in antibiotic development, but they've left this space. And so this big exodus has not just been because of the high risk and low return, which is often cited as the market failure, but it's also because of profits seen in other areas. And this can be reflected in the blockbuster drugs that we've seen in recent years, which are completely focused on cancer, autoimmune, or metabolic diseases. So this slide just gives an overview of the clinical pipeline of those 15 companies. And if the point to be taken away from this is that there was about $124 billion investment in 2022 in R&D by these 15 pharmaceutical companies. So after we've established the fact that this space the antibiotic development space is being dominated by small and medium scale developers, but they are struggling to develop or even make money from whatever they have developed. They're facing bankruptcy, they're facing diminished values, they're facing exits, and many other struggles that they're facing. So finally, we came across the fact that what can be done to support antibiotic development. So there was a growing consensus on the need to support antibiotic R&D through investments, which is basically through broad 2 approaches, which is push and pull. Having said that, after about a decade of push incentives, it's still clear that their success has been less than required, and they need to be supplemented. At the same time, the effect of pull incentives initiated in recent years still needs to be seen. So our story ended with mentioning a few critical reforms that we thought were necessary to stimulate the antibiotic R&D ecosystem. I'll mention a few here, which is the greater public financing and reforms are needed. Governments need to play a greater role, and policymakers need to be aware about the financing rationale and needs. The governments, again, need to come together for coordinated response in terms of prioritizing antibiotics and their developers. There's action needed by countries like the G20, and unless major economies do come together, individual country efforts will have limited long-term gains. But at the same time, there's a need to strike the right balance in public-private partnership for antibiotic development. The notion that only governments should take up the entire burden is not backed by many. But at the same time, the financing or the public financing, it should not be just about bringing the big pharma back. And our story ended with this idea that it's time to consider antibiotics as a global public good. As we rightly mentioned before also, that after the publishing of this story, we conducted a series of webinars, the first of which was conducted in July with a very prominent panel, wherein we discussed holistically the crisis in the antibiotic research and development. And what came out of this very fruitful discussion is that apart from the funding and the financial aspect of it, coordination, collaboration, and prioritization is key for antibiotic development. The specifics we can see here, but I'll just like to focus on one point, which is that there's a need to link all measures to support antibiotic development with access and affordability, particularly in LMICs. The issue of access and antibiotic development cannot be solved without cooperation between countries and stakeholders. Our second webinar held in August was about understanding the challenges small and medium scale developers in India are facing. And once again, what came out of this very rich discussion is that with the importance given to the fiscal measures, there's an equal importance that needs to be given to the non-financing measures as well, which can be regulatory harmonization at a global level, accelerated approval pathways, or something even as basic as nurturing and conserving the discovery talent, because this is something that's not going to be available 10 years down the line, even with all the resources available. I now move on to the agenda for this particular webinar, which is the webinar 3 of our series, which is to understand recognizing antibiotics as a global public good. What can be the challenges and the possibilities for that? So what are goods when somebody says global public goods? What it can refer to is to the advantages that it gives to society from the provision of certain utilities and from satisfying particular wants and needs, such as the eradication of disease or the elimination of pollution. From an economic point of view, the goods that are differentiated into 4 types, which is public, common, club, and private. And these types of goods are commonly understood using 2 parameters, which is rivalry and excludability. Because we focus on public goods, I'll just quickly touch upon what is non-excludability and non-rivalrous, which is that it's made available to all. So a public good is non-rivalrous. At the same time, it's non-excludable, meaning that it's available to all, and it's non-rivalrous, meaning that it can be enjoyed over and over again without anybody diminishing the benefits that they deliver to others. Moving a step ahead, public goods can be national, local, global, international, domestic, etc. So then now we focus on what are global public goods. So over the years, many organizations in their reports or in their documents have articulated the definition of global public goods in their own way. I'll just quickly touch upon the International Task Force on Global Public Goods, which it says is global public goods are those whose benefits could in principle be consumed by the government and people of all states. And there are other definitions as well, which we can hear from our panelists moving ahead. Moving to the AMR aspect of it, globally, currently there are many discussions going around AMR and global public goods. Many prominent bodies and organizations have mentioned this in their documents. For example, the Global Leaders Group on AMR, the World Health in its report in 2017, or the final report of the review published in 2016. I'll end my slide with the key issues and questions that we feel are there, which is that global public good or global common good or any other categorization approach that we can use to better this concept, or some aspects like antibiotics, which is it's not non-rivalrous, might not fit the strictest definition of public good, but antibiotics have the aspects or the attributes of a global common good. And how would things change if it is public versus a common good? The other aspect is if there's any component or aspect of antibiotics or AMR response which can be considered. For example, it can be antibiotic effectiveness, the antibiotic R&D, access, reduced infections, etc. So I'll stop my slide here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Gauri, particularly for bringing us up to the speed, everyone, all the panelists as well as the participants, not only about our assessment, but also about, creating a platform so that now we can actually talk in same language in terms of what is being discussed at the vis-a-vis the global public good or common good. So thank you very much. So Just to let the other panelists know, Gavin requested for slides. So we have given him additional few minutes. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Uh, it's very important for all of us to actually understand from Gavin the concepts, the definitions, and basically how things have evolved and what is the suggested approach from his side in terms of better understanding this. So, Gavin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can I just check whether you can hear me and whether you can see my slides?
Yes, very well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the invitation. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. As Gary mentioned, today we're going to be looking at AMR through the lens of global public goods. And I would like to spend about 6 or 7 minutes, if I may, just thinking through that definition just a little bit more, and why the definition matters, why some of these alternatives out there, might be more valuable. And also, is at the end of the day, is this just an academic exercise? Are we just talking about words, or is there any sort of point to this? So over the next 6 minutes, I'm going to ask kind of why is there attention now, or renewed attention, to global public goods? This conventional definition that Gary presented, what are its limitations? I'm going to touch briefly on 2 alternatives. One that Gary already mentioned, that the WHO is trying to popularize common goods for health, and one that the Commission on Investing in Health proposed about a decade ago, called global functions. I'm obviously biased because I'm involved in that commission, and I want to briefly say why I think that approach can be helpful. So why the renewed attention? Clearly, we are facing a wide array of transnational health challenges that go beyond the boundaries of individual states, and they require international collective action for health. And inaction not only leads to lost lives, millions, around 20 million excess deaths in COVID, but also massive economic losses. The IMF estimates around $14 trillion in economic losses to 2024. And I think we've been largely asleep at the wheel, largely neglecting the need to finance, organize, govern, and deliver this crucial set of international collective action for health activities. But our challenge, I think, is to sort of define those activities. What is this thing that we're talking about when we talk about GPGs? You are very acutely aware of some of these collective action challenges that cross transnational borders. This was Time magazine actually before COVID. We're not ready for the next pandemic. They were right, 2017. Epidemics and pandemics are getting more frequent, as this paper in the New England Journal of Medicine shows. We're also obviously talking specifically about AMR today. The other thing I think that is important to keep in mind as we discuss this issue today is that some of the kind of quoted price tags for action on these international collective action for health activities are large, and you might get kind of sticker shock when you see the numbers, but they pale in comparison to the losses, as I just showed with COVID, and also the returns are very large. Pandemic financing, for example, has a benefit cost ratio of around 7. I wanted to just touch then briefly on the sort of the conventional way in which we think about global public goods. This is from a well-known paper by Suri Moon, Yonani Rottingen. Congratulations to him. He's the new director of the Wellcome Trust, and Julio Frank. And as Gary mentioned, traditionally, when we talk about public goods, we're talking about something that is non-rival, which means that if one person consumes it, it doesn't reduce the availability of others. We can all still consume it. And it's non-excludable. Everybody can access it. No one can be denied. And so when we think about that in global health, I think some of the sort of classic international collective action for health activities we're talking about are, if you publish a study, provided it is open access, and assuming the world can read your PDF, everybody can see that PDF. And if I read it, it doesn't reduce the value of that PDF to others, particularly if it's published under a progressive license, a Creative Commons license. Truly, it can be disseminated freely, translated, turned into other forms. Coming back to actually something that Gary said, are antibiotics themselves a global public good? not strictly speaking, if you had a pile of 10 antibiotics, if I take one of those pills, you've already reduced the value of that pile. However, I think there is a dimension, an element of antibiotics that could be considered global public good, which is that if you have a patent that you share in an open patent pool and everybody can use that patent, there you start to see that there's an element that is a global public good. And of course, WHO guidance, technical guidelines, and so on. This definition then you can already see has some limitations. And we have previously argued in a piece for the Brookings blog that you're not capturing the full array of actions that are needed to address these supranational health challenges. Take the West Africa Ebola epidemic. When it hit, we didn't have a vaccine, treatment, or RDT. Yes, those are global public goods. But surveillance systems were weak. That's something else. And the WHO in its leadership and governance underperformed. That is something else again. So because of these limitations, there are discussions of alternative approaches. The WHO, for example, published about 3 years ago now, just before the pandemic, a report on financing common goods for health. They've been using this term common goods for health as a new construct born out of the observed failures exposed by Ebola, SARS, Zika, other communicable diseases, and other health and environmental risk factors. And they consider common goods for health as being public goods, conventional definition, but also those that have large social externalities and won't arise through market forces alone. And so they require public financing and public action. That is important. And lastly, here is a classification that we at the Lancet Commission on Investing in Health have been using over the last decade that actually has a third subcategory. So we see what we call global functions, the functions of international collective action for health that are addressing these supranational challenges as having three categories: supplying global public goods, as I mentioned just now, sharing IP, sharing patents, market shaping, managing cross-border externalities, and this is where I think AMR fits in, along with pandemic preparedness and response, responding to the movement of non-communicable disease risk factors and so on, where there are health externalities, where you have spillover costs that are suffered by a third party not involved in the action. So an uncontrolled outbreak in your country, AMR in your country, pollution in your country can clearly affect the region and worldwide. Regional or global externalities don't adhere to these local or national borders. And then a third category of leadership and stewardship, something that the WHO does so well. And these are distinct from direct country support. If a donor supports a maternal health program in a specific country, that would not be considered a global function. And that has then allowed us to say, okay, how much is the world spending on this set of global functions? This was our first paper published in the Lancet in 2015 that showed that only about a fifth of health financing, external health financing, is going to global public goods, of which only 4% is going to cross-border externalities, including AMR. And it has also allowed us to track that proportion over time. And what you can see is this common notion of cycles of panic and neglect is actually true, that after Ebola, we did see that proportion rise in response to Ebola, and then it fell again after Ebola was over. We keep seeing these cycles of panic and neglect. And so finally, I would say that we have found it valuable to see these three categories: global public goods, the management of regional and global negative externalities, and fostering leadership and stewardship, a helpful approach. You can see, for example, that we've been able to clarify, I think, define and classify what are some of these essential activities. We clearly need to know what we're prioritizing, how much we're currently spending on these priorities, what the price tag is for those priorities, what the gap is, and it allows us to advocate for closing that gap, for tracking those activities. We went on to develop a machine learning tool that helps us track those activities. It's quite a difficult thing to do. You know, the aid database that we all use to track aid does not have a category for global public goods. So we've been having to do it manually. Now we have a machine tool, and it's capturing this broader array of transnational activities that are critical in preparing for and responding to transnational challenges, including AMR. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Gavin, for succinctly kind of summarizing the problem, if I may say, and not only giving us your perspective on global and common goods, but also sharing with us this new approach that you are suggesting, global functions. So we'll come back to you with questions, Gavin. Let's just move to Anna Fjobelen. Anna is a director from REACT Europe, and Anna, we have requested Anna to actually share her perspective on which aspect of, let's say, antibiotics or AMR response could be considered a global public good, and of course, why? What's the rationale? So Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for inviting REACT and me to this important discussion, where I also think I already learned several new things from Gavin's presentation and from your introductions. REACT, we are a global network dedicated to the fight against antibiotic resistance. And we're part of civil society, and the main activities that we lead are taking place in low and middle income countries. We're working in Zambia, Kenya, India, Indonesia, and several countries in Latin America, including Ecuador and Brazil. And it's of course from that perspective that we take on this work. I mean, we see sustainable access to effective antibiotics as part of everyone's right to health. And that's how we have attacked this issue of global public good over the years. So when we look at antibiotics and the many parts of the response to antibiotic resistance, we see that the clear definition, as also was described by Gavin and others earlier, it's not really fitting in. But we see, as also was mentioned before, I mean, when we talk about cross-border threats, a global action is needed. And we had the example of Ebola that was already mentioned. I mean, if the tools have been there at the time in 2014 and 15, many lives would have been saved. But that was not the priority for any nation or regions even. It was only if we see this as something, a global public good, that, that priority could have been taken. With COVID-19, we saw a very huge mobilization and the vaccine being developed in record speed. But we also saw that once the vaccines were there, the way that those were shared and used was not needs-based, and it was not done with, through the lens of equity. So we have a lot to learn from, I think, from the quite recent history when it comes to this. So I've been asked to look at the question, to dig into the field, which aspects of antibiotics and AMR response that could be considered global public good. So to answer this question, we need to think of clearly the definition and what fits in, but also as been presented, I mean, why would it, when does it make sense? And I think here it's important to look at the different parts of the response and see where is it more efficiently to fight, take on the fight on the global level, regionally, nationally, and locally, knowing that in all these aspects, global collaboration is key. So, and I also want to emphasize one thing already from the beginning. We need overall to find a better way to coordinate the global response. And I think it's very important to have a binding agreement in place that has been established if we compare with the climate change through the Paris Agreement. If it is in the pandemic treaty or a separate agreement, that we will need to see. But this is, I think, very important for anything to kind of work and to have the response that is needed. So just going through a couple of aspects here, if we look at, the first part in the Global Action Plan, which is to improve awareness and understanding of AMR through effective communication, education, and training. I mean, how come we see so little of, information awareness raising towards the public? How come that it's so siloed also on that level? I just recently read one chapter in a book from the Oxford series that had looked at collected data. It was from Ahmad Wazal Saman, 2 years of like real-time data comparing how many mentions and engagement on AMR to the to climate change. And we had 71,000 tweets on AMR, and we had 3.5 million tweets engaged in the climate debate. So this tells us something, that so much needs to be done broadly to reach, to convey the message on the threat that antibiotic resistance is to health and to sustainable development. And here I think there's several aspects that actually could be zoomed into when it comes to, you know, what information can be like seen and shared throughout the definition on global public good. Another aspect is, of course, surveillance and research. Here we have others examples on surveillance. One report as from last year on the health, the crisis within the crisis, showing us how much we lag behind with equipment of medical facilities. Out of 50,000 medical facilities that form that network of the 14 African countries that took part in it, only 1% conducted, possible to conduct bacteriology testing and AMR analysis. So this is a problem that could be seen as regional, but it should be a concern of international and globally. So we can see several of these examples, and I think we will zoom into the R&D issue quite soon. But just to mention also things that can be thought as, you know, need to be solved on facility basis or in communities as a WASH and IPC also are right now drawing less international attention, less global funding and so forth. So therefore, I think we should look at different aspects of this that could be seen as global public good, and also in global functions, or if you want to use other aspects of that. I think I'm now up to my time. Is that correct? Yes. So I'll stop there, and we can continue over in the panel discussion later.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, for basically trying to help us understand it from some other perspectives. I think, as you said, we will come back to you. We will have more from you during the next part of the webinar. So let me just now invite Kerry. Kerry Elgar. Kerry Elgar is a senior policy analyst, development cooperation director at OECD, and we have requested Kerry to share her perspective on funding-related concerns of global public goods. So we move from definition concepts to different aspects, and now to the funding-related issues. So Kerry, please go ahead.
Thanks, Amit, and also to Gary, Gavin and Anna for your fascinating insights. So as noted, I won't speak about the definitional issues. These have recently been raised at the OECD, the organisation that I work for, and it's, you know, it's clear that there's going to be a lot of global discussion around whether we need to define things further, and how, if so, how we do that. And, you know, there's a lot of interesting discussions going on at the UN and elsewhere on that. But today, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is not, you know, whether antimicrobials should be a global public good or not, but rather, you know, how do we fund them as something with all these cross-border benefits that we've already established. So at the OECD, we work on this issue from a couple of different aspects, and the first one is at the policy level. On financing, and through our health work there, we look at the incidence of R&D and investment, for example. So our current analysis shows that for for G20 members outside the OECD, so big emerging economies, including India, that up to 90% of these infections will in fact be resistant by 2035. And even within OECD countries where there's less use at the moment or attention to using antimicrobials as carefully as possible, there's still a large resistance to third-line antibiotics, and that this will more than triple by 2035. So clearly a major challenge heading our way, but difficult to get focus on this when we're hit by a myriad of other challenges increasing in frequency at the moment, including health challenges. And there, the emphasis has been very much, and for the reasons already outlined, on infectious diseases. But lack of investment in R&D in antimicrobials is a fundamental market failure. It's been more than 4 decades since we've seen a novel class of antibiotic. And at last count, I think it's just over about 1% of global investment in pharmaceuticals that we've noted in our analysis, which is equivalent to about 2 billion in R&D for AMR. So this is just the whole global landscape, and I'll go to the development implications next. But just to say that to address this global, I guess, lack of incentives in AMR, we're looking at both pull and push models for antimicrobials, and seeing how this may actually result in or can push or nudge changes in current revenue models for big pharma. So to give you an example, in the last few years, a number of countries, particularly the US and UK, but also the European Commission countries, have scaled up their investments to incentivise R&D. And one example is CARB-X. But most of these incentives target the early phases of the R&D pipeline, and there's a wide recognition that we need to create a sufficient level of incentives for the final stages of pipeline to bring these new antimicrobials onto the market. And one interesting idea here is the so-called Netflix model that you may have heard about, which is increasingly recognised as a potential way forward to address these lack of incentives for antimicrobials. And instead of the conventional model, as the name implies, it's more of a subscription model where countries would pay for access to an antimicrobial in a given year, providing it has the characteristics defined by the country. And the UK is currently testing this approach, and it's something that we'd like to provide further analysis on down the track as one top, I guess, way forward to change the incentives in place. But let me get to this second big issue, which is about financing in development or through development finance, because that's one area which Gavin has focused on, and others too, about an area which we're mainly seeing, I guess, in terms of relationships with global public goods and health in general. And this is, of course, because it's often in low-income countries, particularly least developed countries, where we see the biggest gaps in health in general, and where often they're the same countries in which diseases or health challenges can emerge which affect others. So there has been an increasing amount of spending over time on health through development budgets. So, but this leads to another problem. And just to give you an idea of the scale, we've done some research, and I think our paper might be able to be posted in the chat here, but we've done some research which shows that the estimated development aid from Development Assistance Committee members of the OECD, so they're the main global donors, providing around, I think it's at last count, around 3/4 of global development finance. This has grown from an estimated 30% of average bilateral ODA from 2007 to around 60% at last count. On spending on global public goods as opposed to spending on other areas. So when we compare that, for example, to national government priorities, what we see is that there's been a gradual drop. And of course, we don't measure exactly the same things, and some national priorities can actually be related to global public goods. But what we see generally is a change in the composition of development aid towards greater expenditure on global public goods, and health is one of the biggest areas one of the biggest, I guess, drivers of that change. So at the moment, as Gavin also pointed out, the focus here on spending has been on infectious disease. And this is, there's no, I guess, mystery to this. Ebola was a big shock and a big driver for change in spending patterns. There was, a lot of effort after Ebola to see how we could better incentivize research and development for vaccines in particular after the Ebola crisis. And what we saw in that period was that aid to health almost doubled, and it now is about 16% of total development aid in the package. But a lot of that funding, of course, is not going to antimicrobials. It's going elsewhere. But it's interesting to look at the story around vaccines to see what some of the dilemmas are for development finance in this area. So, for example, there was a lot of money poured into the development of new vaccines, research and development, which ultimately led to vaccines being developed for COVID. But the problem was, of course, that development aid had been used for this purpose, and that afterwards, what we didn't see was these vaccines going first to developing countries. Everyone assumed that the next big pandemic would, in fact, take place in a country in Africa or elsewhere, and that it wouldn't happen in an emerging economy or a developed economy. And of course, what we saw was the opposite. So that shows you one of the big dilemmas related when you talk about incentivizing greater investments in this area, is that it's difficult to look at where that investment in research and development will ultimately end up, even if the COVID vaccines, which came out of that funding, were more heat resistant and applicable to developing country contexts. So it's clearly worth thinking about the role of innovative finance, how to incentivize that, but also look at some of the lessons learned and risks around that. One of the areas that, of course, we could look at for antimicrobials and incentivizing funding are these pull and push mechanisms. There have been some great success stories on pneumococcal vaccines, advanced market commitments, and other forms of pull mechanisms such as prize challenges or subscription models, etc. And in principle, a Netflix subscription type approach to antimicrobials could also facilitate funding for this or better outcomes in countries of lower level of income. In the way that, we've already looked at what Gavi's been doing on vaccinations. So that's one idea, that countries benefiting from such a scheme could also commit to improving surveillance and stewardship of promoting prudent use of antimicrobials, etc., to become eligible to access for a new drug. So that could be one way in which we could look at and what this would mean. But
Gary, I may have to interrupt. Frank has to leave early, and
okay,
it's only 7-8 minutes. If you allow me, I move to Frank.
Sure.
And perhaps come back to know more from you when we have in the second part of the discussion. So thank you, Carrie, for sharing your thoughts on the situation and how the composition of ODA is changing vis-a-vis GHGs and other aspects. Thank you, Carrie. So I move to Frank now. Frank is someone who has been working very closely on the Pandemic Fund. He's from the Pandemic Secretariat, Washington, D.C. And we have requested Frank to share his thoughts on how antibiotics or any other aspect of AMR response, if considered a global public good, would impact its funding as well as the international cooperation. Frank, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to all the speakers and panelists for the great insights in this conversation. This has been really exciting. I wanted to share, if I have time, I wanted to share my screen and maybe a couple of slides with you, if you don't mind. I didn't plan to do that, but maybe that would be helpful. This first slide is something we published in 2019, and basically, we had the idea of this graph reading the book by Jim O'Neill. It shows the sequence between discovery, the clinical introduction of new antimicrobials and resistance found in patients, and sometimes this sequence is contracted, and resistance comes extremely fast, and so we used this title, An Endless Race, for this graph. So of course the dry pipeline is a concern, but we see also a problem with this endless race and antimicrobial resistance. And the other graph I wanted to share with you today is this one, and there again, thanks to O'Neill and his team for the inspiration there. It looks at tuberculosis and other respiratory infections, and how those infections have been brought under control in the US, and you can see what we date as the beginning of the antimicrobial era in the mid 40s. There was substantial, significant progress even before antimicrobials. And what's interesting is that there are many countries where, despite antimicrobials, we don't get that level of progress and control against this type of infections. And the title we've used for that graph was Decentering Antimicrobials. Basically, we don't think that being overly focused on antimicrobials helps in this situation. And I very much enjoyed the first slides of Gauri today, and the three crises of antimicrobials becoming ineffective, this pipeline becoming dry, and the issue of access. And I think that those are entangled compounding crises, and we must address that all together. So very much in line with the reflections on global public good and what is and what is not, and this issue of exclusion and rivalry clearly make difficult to consider antimicrobials as a global public good. If you go back to the 2017 report of the bank, what we said there is that containment of MR is a global public good, and there, of course, we take a very comprehensive, holistic approach to this the issue of AMR. So I think my key message there is let's go back to the roots of this crisis that is strongly a problem of human and sustainable development, access to clean water, prevention of infection, proper use in agriculture, and it would be deleterious not to cover this ground and overly focus on the antimicrobials as such, and the role of the public sector, putting too much emphasis on the public sector, maybe putting too much emphasis on ODA, which is the fate of global public goods, and the tragedy of the commons, and the free ring attitudes of some. I think it is really important to keep this AMR thing really for what it is, that is before anything else, a development issue, human and sustainable development. And finally, I would like to point out another piece of work that we've done on One Health and pandemic prevention, where essentially we've flipped completely the landscape. And of course, global health security is a global public good, but the means to get there are a mix of public good at global, regional, and national level, and also private goods. And ignoring those private goods doesn't necessarily help in getting a just financing of the actions that need to be taken. So I really enjoy this conversation. Glad if we can keep this issue of antimicrobials and the pipeline within this more holistic approach to tackle AMR. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Frank, for your I would say wise words, wise suggestions. I think I hear you. I heard you well. So clearly it's about more holistic approach and not trying to limit it to a particular kind of framework, if I've heard it. And now I have a question to you. We were told that you would not be with us for the next 30 minutes. Is that so? Or you would be able to?
I'm able to stay. I managed to change my agenda, and so I can stay. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So then I will be happy to also put some questions as we move ahead. So Rohit, I request you to now share your thoughts. Rohit Malpani, Senior Advisor, GARTP, and Independent Consultant. We have requested him to share his thoughts on how different approaches supporting antibiotic innovation are linked to antibiotics or any other aspect of AMR response as GPGs. So Rohit, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and I really enjoyed listening to all the comments until now. So I thought I'd try to cover 3 areas, but I'll stop at 5 minutes. The first is just how to think about antibiotics as global public good. So what characteristics of antibiotics either advance or sort of prescribe its characterization as a global public good. The second area I'll try to talk about is different push and pull mechanisms that are used to encourage research and development, and whether or not that advances antibiotics as global public goods. And then if I have time, some other mechanisms or institutions that are both global public goods and can ensure that antibiotics are global public goods. Okay, so what are the characteristics of an antibiotic that affects whether or not it can be a global public good? And I would say there are 5. A couple of them relate to the rivalry of an antibiotic. So one is its supply. So obviously, if you have more supply of an antibiotic, then you have less rivalry. And as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, that became the central issue. With antibiotics, this has been a concern, not so much because of the immediacy of use, but because often there are shortages of antibiotics that therefore lead to rivalry. The second characteristic is appropriate use. So you want to ensure an antibiotic is being used appropriately at present so that it is non-rivalrous with future generations. At the same time, when we try to make appropriate use of an antibiotic at present, we increase its excludability. The other 3 characteristics relate to its excludability. So the first is just the registration of an antibiotic. So what we have today is many antibiotics are simply not registered in most countries. If you look over the last 2 decades, essentially most antibiotics have only been registered in about 15 to 20 countries. And that means that they're just often not available in most of the world. A fourth characteristic is its affordability. So obviously, if an antibiotic is more expensive, it means it's not as available, or it is excluded from certain populations. And then the fifth characteristic is its presentation. So antibiotics and many other health products are often not provided in presentations that can be used widely. One common problem for antibiotics is they're not developed in pediatric formulations. 99% of deaths from pediatric AMR occur in low and middle income countries. So this is essentially a problem that is reserved for the developing world. There are also other challenges with the presentation, such as its thermostability, whether or not it's in an oral formulation, and also its shelf life. Okay, so some different pull and push mechanisms and how they affect whether or not antibiotics are global public goods. So I think Carrie had mentioned subscription mechanisms, and in many respects, a subscription mechanism can be a way of addressing many of those concerns for the countries that actually have the subscription mechanism. So if the UK and the US and Japan and the EU have subscription mechanisms, that can address the challenges that they have. But I think, as Carrie was alluding to, unless we are able to develop effective mechanisms for low and middle income countries that are commensurate with their ability to pay, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of an antibiotic as being only a regional good or a national public good. So one of the things that the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership is working on with the World Health Organization is to develop an appropriate mechanism called SECURE that essentially would help to improve access to essential antibiotics in low and middle income countries that are required. However, even if a subscription mechanism is developed in different countries and is applied globally, the other challenge that could still arise is the priorities ultimately that will guide developers will ultimately be those countries that can pay the most. So we know that different pathogens affect different countries. Again, as I mentioned, pediatric AMR only affects low and middle income countries. So this may not necessarily change the priority setting for AMR, even if it ensures wider availability. Another example of a pull mechanism is a prize. And so a prize can either be something that is given during clinical development, it's called a milestone prize, or a prize that's given when a new antibiotic comes to market, and that's called it can be called a market exclusivity reward or an end stage prize. And those could be effective to create global public goods insofar as we have the right conditions in place. In exchange for a prize, does a company give up its intellectual property? Does it ensure its affordability? Does it ensure it has the right product characteristics? Do we have enough supply? So a prize can only work if we have the right conditions in place. And if you have a milestone prize, for example, you have to ensure that there are other developers that can carry on development through to access. The one push mechanism I want to mention before my time runs out is the organization I advise, the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership. So CARB-X does early stage research and development. The GARD-P does late stage research and development and access. And this can be important because it works on a not-for-profit basis in partnership with the private sector and also with the public sector, including in India. And this means we can address issues of affordability, of registration, of presentation, including for children, and of supply. But the challenge for GARD-P is, are companies and the public sector willing to share their compounds or license their compounds to GARD-P to be able to take forward its development? Do we have enough funding to be able to carry out this work? And ultimately, are we able to develop products in the presentations that are required in low and middle income countries? And also, when we receive a license for a company to develop a new product, what territory are we provided? So in some situations, for one product, for example, GARD-P only has a territory of 67 countries, whereas for a recent license it signed for an antibiotic called cefiderocol, we have a territory of 135 countries, which means that we can take a much broader remit of trying to ensure that this antibiotic can be available as a public good. All right, I'll stop there, and maybe I can come back to some of these other mechanisms that can help contribute towards making antibiotics public goods in the Q&A.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you very much. So clearly, we have very interesting insights from all 5 speakers. I would just request all speakers to perhaps switch on their videos so we can start the Q&A. We have about 25 minutes. There's no way we can do justice to this topic in considering the variety and the extent of, I would say, understanding that is now being reflected. So it's too much for this 25 minutes. I will not try to do a lot of back and forth. What I think is I should just put one set of questions to each one of you. Maybe you can take about 3 to 4 minutes to share your comprehensive understanding to take your message forward to the next level. So I'll start with Gavin. Gavin, if I hear you well, my question to you would be, now, clearly this is about definitions. This is about lack of consensus and lack of clarity, or let's say over inclination to stick to a particular definition. And then you have talked about a new approach, which is global functions. So it's too many questions in one question. So clearly, how critical do you think that we should actually do away with the global good or common good approach and move to the global functions? And if yes, why? And where do you see the consensus or let's say greater, different other organizations now building up and talking about or accepting the global functions, the approach that you are talking about? So in a way, I'm trying to ask you one straight question. How critical it is to take it forward as a global functions? And or is it because that you think that the revival of global public good is because of the failure of global public good as a concept? And now it is imperative that we should move to a new approach, and that new approach has to be global functions. So just share your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I'll be as brief as I can, because that's obviously quite a complex question. I mean, I think, yes, the WHO launched its Common Goods for Health program in, I think it was 2017 or 2018. I was part of that committee. Because it saw during Ebola and Zika, and then as we saw during COVID, a whole bunch of failures that went beyond global public goods failures, far beyond that. There were failures in surveillance, there were failures in global leadership and stewardship, there was failures in advocacy, including advocating for the most vulnerable and dispossessed populations. And so I think there has been a push for a broader concept that helps to flag. I mean, it's not going to change the world, but it just helps to flag that if we only stick to very narrow definitions, we are missing critical functions. There is also, and I hope Kerry might speak to this, an awareness that we need to do better at tracking action towards those. And I think definitional clarity helps us. There is this concept, and I would love Kerry to comment on this maybe, of total official support for sustainable development, TOSD. And that somehow links to global public goods. And I would love Kerry to say something more about this. At the end of the day, I think that the just like thinking about definitions in this very academic way isn't helpful alone. I think it then has to be tied to actual policy action. So your definitional clarity is to then say, okay, now that we know what we're talking about, how are we doing? Like what, where are the gaps? How do we close those gaps? What are some interesting, innovative mechanisms? Rohit laid those out beautifully for actually tackling. If you identify the needs and the gaps, what are some of the innovative mechanisms for closing them? I mean, just before the pandemic hit, I co-authored a paper with Anya Sukat, who was head of health systems financing at WHO at the time, and Dean Jameson and others, when we actually called for a compulsory financing that every country would contribute according to its means. There has not been very much political appetite for that, but I will go to my grave believing in that concept. I know that some countries don't like, these global taxes and so on. But, we have seen some movement in that area. The airline tax that UNITAID used to raise several billions. I wouldn't totally rule it out. And I think that the world is a mess right now. And I honestly do think that some kind of compulsory financing is going to be needed for these multiple challenges, climate, AMR, conflict, going forwards. Over.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Moving to Kelly. Moving to Anna, actually, yeah. So Anna, quick response on, you've talked about different aspects, surveillance, public awareness, research, WASH, IPC, and there's a paper I know which talks about antibiotic effectiveness, which some of the people who have been working with REACT are co-authors. I'm just trying to understand from you of course, do you see any part of this better aligned with the current definition of global public good, or you see no, there's no real reason for us to stick to that definition? Let's pick up one or two aspects and move ahead. And I also want to ask you one question. What has been your experience of working or interacting with the stakeholders in the EU with respect to this concept so far?
Thank you so much. And I will also try to be to be brief. As you mentioned, the article that we wrote together was under this specific edition on a journal on law and medical ethics, concerned on pandemic treaty, pandemic preparedness and response. And there, what we discussed there was really the antibiotic effectiveness being, because I think that's, you know, broadening it from, you know, the antibiotics themselves, or but we have a shared responsibility of this resource globally to secure that it can continue to be effective, and that also people have access to it when needed. So it's really both a right and a responsibility. So it is with that in that frame. And I think the question you ask, how like useful it is quite important. Also, I mean, I don't think anyone wanted it to be an academic exercise, but it to be something of value. And here, what I think is, you know, a little bit what Rohit talked about, you know, the process of making, you know, having something to become more of co-owned global resource. So to look at all the different, you know, policy proposals and mechanisms that could be in place with that lens. I'm not sure if that makes sense. On the EU level, where REACT has engaged more is actually on the different proposals and policies that have been discussed on R&D and access. And there comes in the different subscription models that has been developed by European countries, Sweden being one. And where we think, you know, and again, it's through that lens, we know that these models will function for certain countries, but it's not a solution for low and middle income countries. It does not drive innovation. It is more, I mean, it's quite limited to what that those proposals can do. And there's also some suggestions that we also think actually counterproductive when it comes to the TEV, for example. So those will be my short answers to that question.
Thank you, Anna. Kelly, first, of course, Gavin wants you to talk about TOSSD. Please do that. Share your thoughts on that. But my question to you again is one question. I mean, many questions in one question. So essentially, I would really like to know, I see that you have talked about the composition changing towards in favor of, let's say, global public goods in terms of financing, but a lot on infectious disease, but not specifically on AMR. That's a broad understanding that I can get. So my question is there any estimate as on today in terms of how do we know how much ODA is attributed to, let's say, AMR? And if at all, how much is that, you think? A larger point of my question is, and this is something you have also written, that the overall kitty remains the same. And a lot of this is about adding new money to it and not really about trying to rejuggle the existing money. And then, of course, there are learnings that you've talked about the COVID response. So how do you see, considering what you know on the funding aspect, the challenges, how do you see the way ahead, how we move forward in terms of having more money towards, let's say, GPGs, and particularly if AMR is considered, then how can we reach to that if we want to?
Well, thank you. They're big questions. I'll start with the easier one first. And Gavin, you linked this to measurement and the fact that, you know, it's very difficult to measure flows going to AMR or to other specific areas, GPG related areas in particular. Our paper that was referred to, that I think is posted in the chat, or I will do shortly, is actually trying to do that by compiling a range of different current criteria in what we call our creditor reporting system. And that is a really tricky process, because getting changes in the definition of aid means you lose comparability over time for those flows. There's a big debate in you know, a lot of opposition to doing that, because you lose that ability ability to see what's going up and what's going down. But there's an argument, of course, that with the big changes in composition that we're seeing in aid, that maybe it's time to open some of those things up. And we are looking forward to, we get this demand from WHO all the time. We are looking forward to working a lot more on that in the future, as well as trying to join that work up across different OECD committees, including with our national health accounts. So at the moment, we don't measure the same things. That's also a problem for TOSSD, which is Total Official Support for Sustainable Development, which attempts to measure what it calls international public goods, but that's another definitional debate, attempts to measure those cross-border flows. It largely relies on the CRS as well as adding other flows, so aid flows as well as private investment and other flows into that. So that's only really, we've been looking at that at health for just a couple of years now, and we're still getting that data together. We are finding pretty big increases, but it's really difficult to hone down on. I mean, you've estimated AMR or antimicrobials as 4% of all of that in ODA. It's difficult to get to that. I'll try and answer your question really quickly, Amit, on what does all this mean for the future. Current spending on health is about 30 billion on the development finance side, just under 30 billion at its COVID peak. That's our latest data. It'll be most of that was additional, and so it didn't impact on previous flows in other SDG areas. What will be interesting to see in the future is if that does. We're looking at a crisis now related to Ukraine, other crises coming thick and fast in the headlines, and will that mean that health financing remains stable and keeps going up, or will it mean that it decreases? And I think that's the big question for the future, which may also be an area that we need to look at for other more silent crises like antimicrobials. So the more that we can communicate and get recognition on this agenda, I'd say the better. There are big debates on the in the global agenda, and where I would be looking is the next post sustainable development, post global goals agenda. I suspect, and this is a personal view, but from what I'm reading and seeing, I suspect that we will see a lot more global public goods related discussions going on ahead of that, because there are so many win-wins involved in the future for this globally, for global stability. At the same time, there's a real need to protect the priorities that developing countries have for their own development, and to ensure that development aid goes to the poorest and most vulnerable. So it's going to be a huge debate going forward, and I think one that's going to be at the centre of our discussions at the OECD's Development Committee.
Thank you, Kerry. And I know I asked very, very challenging questions, but it helped. So coming to Frank now. Frank, I clearly see you. You are talking about taking a higher view, more holistic view. But I would also like to kind of, in a way, put this question to you that we have reached a stage from AMR as a sustainable development issue, AMR as a health issue, to livelihood issue, to economical issue, to development issue. And now we have reached a stage where we are trying to elevate this, or let's say elevate, but at the same time, position it or categorize it in the way that which basically calls for more global attention, more money, more funds. Recognizing that, yes, there are big challenges and ultimately the larger kitty is same or perhaps nearly the same. In this context, there's a certain point that the global deliberations on GPGs have reached, right? Do you really see we should go back? Or you think maybe we can address it in this way, but still be more holistic in our approach, by just being not talking about antibiotics, but maybe AMR containment, AMR response, or AMR effectiveness overall as a middle path. So over to you, Frank.
Thank you. And maybe I will start by not answering your question, but continuing on Kerry's points and Gavin's points as well. Maybe to say that it's important to know and understand what's the ODA flow and where things are going. But it would be so critically important to know what the domestic resources are, how domestic resources are used and mobilized as well. So not only we know what international aid is contributing to, but how countries are investing in those issues and behave as good neighbors, if we may say so. So that's something that at the bank we increasingly look into, and better understanding what's the public expenditures on some of those aspects, such as pandemic prevention and preparedness, antimicrobial resistance, One Health, and yes, the debate on global public goods is getting a huge momentum, and maybe good to look at the annual meetings of the World Bank, and how we were articulating those global challenges and the evolution roadmap for the bank. So it's clearly core and central. I think that we, to go back to your question, hopefully I understand it correctly. We somehow strain ourselves a bit by becoming too narrow or too specific. And for an international financing institution like the bank, the challenge of AMR has been that it's too big to be ignored, but not big enough to become mainstream, and that combined to the difficulty of the country demand-driven model that we have. It has been extremely difficult to boost or mainstream investments on AMR, be AMR specific interventions or AMR sensitive interventions, and the approach would be more to blend AMR in most of our investments. Investments in water and sanitation, investments in livestock, investment and agriculture, investments in healthcare systems and strengthening public health systems. And that is what is more promising, is to apply more systematically an AMR lens on those investments for sustainable and human development. And this is where so we reconcile this global concern of AMR and the global public good mention of containing AMR with the country priorities for development. So back to Kerry's point. I hope I answered your question.
Thanks, Frank. It is increasingly becoming clear that it's not that simple to take it forward. But nevertheless, I'm happy that we are doing this discussion, and we will do quite a lot, quite many of these. It is quite apparent now for us to have a better grip on the subject. So I move to Rohit now. Rohit, you are someone, in my view, who has actually been able to very directly link the attributes of GPGs to the current initiatives, push and pull, and which serves what part of the GPG. Now, I think you have a very specific view, is what I could sense. But I would like to basically, as you have heard everyone, and you have, in my view, you are well positioned to actually sum it up for us. How do you see, what in your eyes, in your view, is the way ahead? Or let's say, big challenge and way ahead. What is the roadmap I mean, for example, I do not even know right now that which agency governs or will manage if something is to be told as global public good. Who decides? There are some questions which are so simple, but perhaps not in the common knowledge. So if you could spare a few minutes to just let us know your thoughts on big challenge, the roadmap, how do you see this going forward?
Yeah, oof, that's pretty tough. No, but no, I think you're hitting on the right question at the right moment. And I think, you know, the question of who decides. So if we think about historically, really any transnational challenge, but I think obviously this applies to AMR, we didn't really have a mechanism. We didn't necessarily identify it as an issue. And if we did have a mechanism, it was to leave it to the market. And so we know all the dysfunctions that has led to over the last 5 to 6 decades, whether we talk about it from an environmental perspective and agricultural perspective, as Frank was noting, and then from a human health perspective and a pharmaceutical perspective. And so, you know, in some ways, I think there was this burst of optimism. I think first, you know, I think the European Union around 2010 as a sort of regional entity had sort of made a priority around AMR and had started to sort of put together governance around AMR. And I think you see that reflected in some of the policies that the EU has taken forward, and then not necessarily in others, or not necessarily in ways that contribute to addressing AMR as a global public good. You then had subsequently, and you know, I think Anna walked through very well the Global Action Plan that, you know, presumably laid out a series of ways in which governments could collectively work together to address the issue. And then finally, the UN high-level meeting on AMR 2 years later, which, you know, saw heads of state sort of agree to what they felt were the actions that take place. And I was just working on this the other day, but if you think about global governance of AMR, if that's really what we're getting at, it really hasn't progressed from then. We've kind of moved sideways at best, or I'd argue even in reverse, just given the scale of the challenge that we now see with the health data that has emerged, and the fact that the investments and the governance and the collaboration hasn't necessarily materialized. So we still are pretty much, I think, in you know, in a state of nature. We do have a lot of one-off examples, and I think a lot of us have listed off the different things that have been done to sort of try to rectify this. But the challenge going into next year is whether or not, I think, especially the UN high-level meeting on AMR is just going to replicate what has already been said, and that is sort of the cynicism now that I think people have for all of these UN high-level discussions, or if governments are actually going to say that, you know, we at least have to have some initial mechanisms in place that just don't leave this to whatever each country thinks is appropriate. And so I think that is our collective challenge going forward, is the accountability that government should have, and the idea that ultimately it's in everyone's best interest to try to come to some collaborative agreement. And that's not going to come through a pandemic framework. I think that's what we're already seeing in the discussions, both at the World Bank in terms of what the pandemic fund covers in the pandemic treaty. And ultimately, I think AMR requires its own governance, its own models, and its own commitments from all sectors.
Thank you, Rohit. I know I was again it was too challenging, but you did well. So Rajeshwari, 30 seconds, last 30 seconds for you. Do you have any comments?
Thank you, Amit. Like you said, I think this webinar has been a lot of learning for me, Gauri, as well as Amit, and a lot of reading to go back and do. That is one. And the second aspect, which I possibly picked up, is the area of disease, which Anna and Gavin mentioned, how disease management in previous crises like COVID, Ebola, Zika, I think it is an area which we again need to go back and see how the experiences there have worked, and how the GPG concept, if it had been implemented, how things would have changed. So maybe that's a big takeaway for me to go back and look apart from the other aspects. Thanks, Amit.
Thank you. Thank you. So I will just sum it up, take 60 seconds, not more than that. So clearly, thank you very much. A big thanks to every one of you, each one of you, for such wonderful exchange of information. I just want to say that we knew that this was a tough topic, but we did not knew it was this tough. So we will try our best. I also hope that all the participants have something they have also picked up some or the other thing for them to ruminate over and perhaps be more informed we certainly are much more informed. There clearly are more questions than answers now. There clearly are more need for clarity, need for consensus before we move ahead on this, clearly. At the same time, we may have to also figure out and strike a balance in terms of how we move ahead because it is beyond a point, it is an advocacy issue also. It has reached to a stage. It's like, do we want allow perfect to become the enemy of the good? That's where we have to perhaps also think how we move ahead on this. I know there's a lot of movement happening at the GLG level. I also know that if I read other World Bank reports, there's a lot of discussion on GPGs. So clearly, how we move ahead, what is the nuanced situation, is something that is for all of us to know in the near future. I would just say a big thank you again to everyone. Lots of learnings. I can just promise that CSC will come back to you if we have any questions. I can also promise that CSC will try its best to read more, understand more, engage more, and come up with something that informs the global discussions in a much more better way. So with that, thank you, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.